Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Pamela Lavitt, the Director of Arts and Ideas and Festivals at the Stroum Jewish Community Center in Seattle. I am absolutely so pleased to have you joining us this evening. This is a very special treat, and we're so glad you chose to join us. I am absolutely delighted to introduce our guest, but before I do, I just wanted to give you a little bit of housekeeping and also tell you a little bit about some upcoming programs. And in particular, I wanted to mention, of course, that the Seattle Jewish Film Festival is coming up. We are going to be virtually together again. For those of you who are joining us nationally, sadly, the film world has gotten a bit wise and we can't show films anymore from Dubai to South Africa to Israel to Seattle to New York. So when you check our website, seattlejff.org or seattlejewishfilmfestival.org, just you'll check out whether or not it's a national screening or not, but we have 19 films coming your way, lots of Zoom programs. And as we say, we are resuming a virtual festival in March. So March 4th through 18th is the Seattle Jewish Film Festival. Please mark your calendars and come and check it out. I'll put in the chat box the website so you can see what the offerings are. Tickets go live on February 3rd, which is Wednesday next week. I also wanted to encourage everyone, please, to check out an upcoming author event. We are so pleased to have Seattle's own Bill Gates will be joining us, and that is a national JCC Literary Consortium event. This is a Jewish Book Council event, and I'm very pleased to have them as partners for Jonathan Sarna's book. But the National Literary Consortium is bringing Bill Gates across the country. That is taking place on February 24th, and you can find out more on our website at sjcc.org/arts, and I'll also put that in the chat. Without further ado, I am so pleased to welcome our special guests today. First of all, I wanted to say very much thank you to the Jewish Book Council. We have been running virtual programs since we closed in March, and the author programs and the conversations have been so rich and varied. And we are winding down basically until the film festival with this program and Bill Gates, so thank you for joining us. I wanted to take a moment to just introduce our guests, but again, we're using the chat feature. Please submit your questions. The program will run about 40 minutes and then we'll get to your questions. And I wanted to first welcome and ask to join us on Zoom is Professor Dr. Jonathan Sarna. He is the Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University and directs its Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. He is the chief historian also of the National Museum of American Jewish History, and he is the author and editor of more than 30 books. I've heard him speak many times, and I'm so excited to have him here to talk about this particular book, Cosella Wayne. And while I mention it, those of you who ordered the book, and many of you did, we will be mailing them next week. They're a little bit on back order, but the university is getting us these next week. So I will update you over email. So please welcome Jonathan Sarna. Thank you for joining us. I also want to welcome, thank you. Judith Rosenbaum is both a friend and a former co-worker, I should say. I used to work at the Jewish Women's Archive. Actually, it's before she became CEO, but she's done incredible things working for the Jewish Women's Archive. And please, if you have not checked out jwa.org, please do. There's also an exhibit that I worked on called Seattle Stories there, where I was oral historian, but they've done so much more. It is the best website for Jewish women and women's research as far as I'm concerned. Judith is a pioneering digital archive and public history organization that documents Jewish women's stories, elevates and voices, and inspires them to be agents of change. An educator, historian, and writer, Judith earned her PhD in American Studies from Brown University, and she teaches and lectures widely in Jewish studies and women's studies, and also serves on the faculty of the Bronfman Fellowships. She was recently awarded the Schusterman Fellowship for Jewish Leaders. We are so pleased to have these two amazing people joining us today. You're in for a real treat. So please, everyone, sit back and enjoy. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you, Professor Sarna, as well. This is just an amazing opportunity to explore this story, and I want to, first of all, thank you for uncovering the story of Cora Wilburn and bringing this book, the first novel written and published in English by an American Jewish woman, bringing it back to us, making it available. It doesn't happen every day that historians find these kinds of rich sources. So I'd love to start by hearing a little bit about how you rediscovered Cora Wilburn and what your process was of, bringing what you found into our hands with this book.
Well, thank you. And let me also say what a joy it is to be with everyone, albeit virtually. I've personally been in Seattle, so I know what a wonderful community it is, and glad that we're able to be together in this virtual fashion. And thank you, Judith. We'll be on first name terms. Thank you for agreeing to be the moderator and to ask questions. It's a wonderful question, and I suppose I should say that in a way I've been stalking Cora Wilburn for many years. Whenever you read a list of 19th century Jewish women writers, and it's a rather short list, um, her name would be there. And all the other names, Emma Lazarus, we know who Emma Lazarus is. And many of the others may be a little bit more obscure. And then there's Cora Wilburn, an unusual name, doesn't sound very Jewish. Nobody knew anything about her. And I hope Judith won't be angry if I say even the Jewish Women's Archive I didn't know about her, and her name wasn't in the encyclopedia, and even the great Jacob Rader Marcus, he didn't know anything about her. So what you do in such cases is every time you find some mention of the individual, you write it on. In the old days, you wrote it on a 3x5, you put it in a file, and you hope that maybe at some point there'd be material. And I did find interesting things. So she wrote this very interesting letter to a very young Henrietta Zold, encouraging her, saying how happy she was that there was a young woman teaching Russian Jews in the Russian school. And then later, a volume appeared with letters from Mary Anton. Mary Anton was also a significant writer from Boston. And suddenly there's a letter of Mary Anton, and she says, "Oh, I went to visit Cora Wilburn. She's the most interesting woman I know in many respects." So, you know, this was really quite fascinating. And then I found some poems by Cora Wilburn in Jewish magazines. And then a few years ago, I got an invitation to join a group at the August Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, modeled on the one in Princeton. And it was going to be devoted to what they called the study of Jewish women's cultural capital. And I really wanted to take advantage of that opportunity. You don't get invited every day. Um, so I had to find some important area in Jewish women's history that would be worthwhile investigating. And I rather recklessly said, I have various notes on Cora Wilburn. At the very least, I'll write the first article on Cora Wilburn, and then I recruited a couple of Brandeis students to help me scour this internet. I can't say I was expert in the internet, but they knew how to look. I said, let's look. It's a very unusual name. Let's find everything we can find on Cora Wilburn. And something absolutely astonishing happened, which was that there were hundreds of pages of small print prose and poetry by Cora Wilburn spread over a wide range of journals, most of them not Jewish at all, but like the what you're seeing here, these were spiritualist newspapers and magazines. the spiritualist movement was an important movement in the 19th century. Here it was actually beginning to grow rapidly. Its fastest era of growth was the Civil War, for the simple reason that spiritualists said that they could help you talk to the spirits of the dead. Well, unfortunately, in the Civil War, there were a lot of them, and spiritualism grew. I now know Cora Wilburn was involved earlier, but in any case, I found all of these articles in journals. Naturally, I printed them all out, and now I knew I had what to read in Jerusalem, and I sent by FedEx so it wouldn't get lost these two huge notebooks of Cora Wilburn material, and I sat and began reading. Um, and eventually, and we just saw it, I I reached her serialized novel, Cosella Wayne, which began on the front page of the March 31st issue of the Banner of Light. That was once a quite widely read journal, and it immediately captured my attention because its central character were Jews. 1860, a novel about Jews in America. And it was clear to me, I knew enough about the literature. There's nothing like it. And actually, it anticipates a lot of themes that we previously imagined only came later in American Jewish life: intermarriage, generational tension, family dysfunction, Jewish Christian relations, immigration, poverty, the place of women in Jewish life, um, romantic love, and the tension between fathers who wanted to marry their daughters off, and daughters who thought that they should only marry for love. Cora Wilburn, in the end, never married, and the whole tension between destiny or predestination and free will. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the novel, and it became clear to me that this novel would be a way of introducing readers to Cora Wilburn. Parts of the novel are deeply spiritualist and honestly a little bit alienating to some readers, but parts of the novel are absolutely amazing. And they describe Jewish communities all over the world, Venezuela and India and so on. And I now know that she visited those places, which was tremendously unusual in the 19th century when you traveled by sail. Um, and then, so I thought, um, uh, by using this novel as an anchor, I could then tell the story of Cora Wilburn, and I spent lots of time trying to piece together her story, and maybe we can talk about that, and then I had three discoveries. I discovered the novel, and then amazingly, I found the diary, which is the basis clearly for the novel. I mean, you only have that opportunity once in your life in a way. And there's the diary in now in the American Jewish Archives, and then I found her picture. I was wondered. My wife said I spent much more time with Cora Wilburn than I did with her in Jerusalem. What does this woman look like? And eventually, by following every lead, I struck lucky and found that as well. So those are the three discoveries. I'm happy to talk about each of them. Yeah, there's the picture. If you wonder what she looked like. By the way, I'll say now, Cora Wilburn was not her original name. Her original name was Henrietta Pulvermacher. Maybe if your last name was Pulvermacher, you'd change it too. Pulvermacher simply means powder maker, but she, I think, changed her name, not just in order to fit in, but in lots of ways, her, as I make clear in the introduction, as the novel makes clear, her father was continually changing his name. He was a crook, and she learned about name changing, and I think that she adopted this name of Cora Wilburn, especially as she assumed a new life as an author.
So you've given us an enormous amount to dig
Yes.
into here, and I love that you've given us a little taste of the process of the historian and how tenacious one needs to be in order to stay on the trail, even when the trail is sometimes a little cold, and figure out how to put all these pieces together. But I think one of the questions that emerges when you hear about how rich her work is and how much was out there to be discovered, why is it that she'd been forgotten in the first place? I mean, why wasn't she a household name? Why wasn't she someone who would be celebrated as a pioneering American Jewish writer?
So it's really a wonderful question. Why are people forgotten, and why, on the other hand, was Emma Lazarus remembered? Part of it has to do with whether there are family members who really keep the name alive. Emma Lazarus was a significant family. She had a sister who really cared, and the family kept it alive. Even Anzia Yazirska, who was forgotten for some years, had family who really felt that their matriarch should be rediscovered, and were happy to encourage those who wanted to write about the writer. None of that is true about Cora Wilburn. She is orphaned. She never marries, therefore has no children, and there was nobody really to remember her. But I also argue here that in some ways, because she didn't really live up to the community's rather shifting ideals. She didn't marry. She at one time had converted and then returned to Judaism, but still, in the 19th century, you never could live down the fact that you had, as they would have said, apostatized, even if you came back. Um, she didn't live all that close to the community. She had all sorts of fairly radical ideas. Um, she was way ahead of her time. I mean, in terms of her views on women, which I'm sure alienated some folks. And in other words, she was somewhat subversive and independent minded. And those kinds of people are much more likely to be banished from cultural memory. And the last thing I would say is we're now learning that whereas men had an easier time getting publishers to take material that they published in magazines and bring it together between the covers of a book. So Mark Twain, even though much of what he published had originally appeared in magazines, none of us read them in magazines. They appeared in a lot of important books. And that's true of many men. Was much harder for women to get. They didn't have independent means, which would have allowed them to front the money. They didn't have publishers who would believe in them in this way, and a lot of them never published in books. There's a new volume on a superwoman and other stories by a woman named Michelson. It's later, but it's the same story. She left her material in journals, and I think we're going to see many more recovered books by women. Now that so many newspapers and magazines have been scanned, and you can search the internet and find them, I think we're going to find a lot of these treasures um, that will rewrite in some ways literary history, and certainly remind us that there were many more women writers, and much important work that has simply been lost in these newspapers of old.
Well, I certainly hope so. I think that's an exciting possibility. But as you said, uh, so much of Wilburn's story, of her personal story, and what she wrote in the novel was sort of marginal to Jewish life, or marginal to the ways that the Jewish community may have wanted to see itself. So, for example, the novel depicts a Jewish father who's abusive to his daughter. Now, it's not that we haven't seen that in American Jewish literature, but we've seen more of it maybe in the 20th century. I'm thinking, for example, you mentioned Yezierska. I'm thinking of The Bread Givers, which is a kind of
Mhm.
classic example of that. So why does it, what happens when we see that in the 19th century too? What information does that give us that's new and different about 19th century Jewish life that we get from Wilburn's
Mhm.
writing
So
from her life?
um, we actually didn't really have much in the way of novels from the so-called Central European period of American Jewish life. Indeed, there were people who had all sorts of theories. They didn't write novels. Only East European Jews influenced by Russian literature, like Abraham Kahan, they wrote novels. But it's clear that that's not quite true. And there are remarkable aspects of this novel. For one thing, unlike later literature, she gives us a very rich portrait of the seamstress. Before the clothing trade, East European Jews, you had sweatshops, but you had ready-made clothing. But she is really depicting Jewish life in the early 1850s. People would bring a seamstress into their house and so on. And she is depicting this group of women who sadly earn their living with their fingers. That's a whole world of which we know little. The other thing we learn is about poor Jews. Not surprisingly, we read a lot more, especially in Jewish newspapers, about rich Jews, and where we hear about poor Jews, they tend to be through the eyes of the women bountiful who went out and helped them. So Rebecca Gratz is in Philadelphia, very significant figure, and she's involved with organizations that help to ameliorate the condition of poor Jews. But we never hear from the poor Jews themselves. And in this book, amazingly, we do, for the simple reason that when the Cora Wilburn, or as she first was Henrietta Pulvermacher, and then she was Henrietta Jackson, she grows up wealthy. Her father is a diamond dealer. Now, we now know that they were fake diamonds, And that's why he had to run from place to place, hoping that by the time people figured out he'd swindled them, he'd be long gone. But in any case, he had a lot of money. But then, and she describes this in the novel, and it's confirmed in the diary. First of all, he throws her out, and second of all, he dies, and her mother had previously died. And when he dies, right there it is. This article describes, this was another nice find, describes really her father, Puffermacher, and how he cheated people. Um, um, and the um, he dies, and all of the money is lost or stolen, and she suddenly discovers herself poor. That's unusual already. Women who descend into poverty, and she gives us a very full picture of what that poverty was like. And there are portraits of Jews who didn't treat the help very well, even if they were Jewish help. Some will be shocked. Imagine that. Um, uh, and then she's kind of discovered, and the spiritualists, a new movement, encourage her. They take her in, and she moves from earning her living as a seamstress to earning her living as a writer. That already was much more respectable. She writes poems. She publishes this book. And now it's a book of poetry. You don't get rich on poetry, but it's interesting, and you can really see in these poems how she was influenced by spiritualism, the movement. Her father, as I said, sold precious gems, and he used them as a vehicle for cheating people. She finds spiritual significance in each of these gems. She shows she knows her gems, and each one teaches values and has deep meaning, and so on. Now, one may or may not today be impressed with that, and I should say that she herself abandons spiritualism not long after this book appears. Um, but she is a writer, and she earns her living as a writer, which was a very hard way to earn a living. And she wrote an amazing amount, at least so far as I know. She is the most prolific 19th century American Jewish woman. If anybody listening wants projects, I've got still two big notebooks of her novels and poems, and much of it could be still analyzed. And in spiritualist circles, in her period of greatest literary creativity, she would be widely read. What you're seeing now is interesting. As I said, I found her diary. Let me say a word of how do you find a diary, and then I'll say what you're
And
seeing
how do
here.
you decode it is the other question I know from
Well, yeah.
that's a whole other project.
So first of all, I had said earlier there was nothing on Cora Wilburn. At a certain point, I discovered in the Boston Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Advocate had an article, one article on Cora Wilburn a few years after she died. And the author of that article quoted a diary. And there were interesting quotes. So naturally, a historian says, wow, a diary exists. Of course, problem was that article appeared, I'd have to look up, it's about 1910, and a long time had passed. I searched everywhere I could think of. Obviously, you start at the major archives, and then you move to minor archives. I even went because I knew that she knew the rabbi at Temple Ohavei Shalom in Boston. I asked them would they let me rummage around, and probably silly, how could you find a little diary? But anyway, I didn't. And then, maybe it's chance, or maybe, as I tell the students, a chance like that comes to the prepared mind. I see a handwritten letter that was sent to Jacob Rader Marcus, whom I knew very well. He was really the founder of American Jewish history and the founder of the American Jewish Archives, and a woman from Boston, Sadie Cohen. She was the widow of an important judge and very important at Ohavei Shalom. I knew that the Cohens knew Cora Wilbur. And Sadie Cohen thanks Dr. Marcus for letting her know that the papers of the diary of Cora Wilburn have been received with the minutes of the Bethel Synagogue. And I was sitting in Jerusalem, and a light bulb, there's the letter, a light bulb went off in my head. I said, well, then the diary must be at the American Jewish Archives. I knew Jacob Rader Marcus, not like he got a 19th century diary and said, I'll throw it away. And yeah, that's not how you build a great archive. So it must be there, but it wasn't in the catalog, and nobody knew about it. And this will interest you, Judith, and I hope other readers. Every once in a while, it's good to have gone to graduate school. I went to graduate school just at the time when women's history was getting going. I hope you won't mind my mentioning your mother was so central. And I clearly remember a talk at Yale about how do you find the sources of women's history. It wasn't a Jewish women's archive and so on. And the scholar pointed out that very often women's material was was cataloged with their husbands, with institutions. They didn't catalog it on its own. Women hadn't quite been invented or discovered. They plunked it somewhere. And your job is to find it. And one of the things that has happened over the past 40, 50 years, it's a while, is how much has been discovered. So, for example, Matilda Schechter, the wife of Solomon Schechter, her papers, which are fascinating, were plunked in the last box of the Solomon Schechter papers. Anyway, the problem was Cora didn't have a husband, but I had a clue. It said they'd been received with the minutes of the Bethel Synagogue. So I wrote to my friend, the archivist at American Jewish Archives. His name was Kevin Prophet. And I said, Kevin, look in the Bethel Synagogue. I mean, Bethel Synagogue in Boston was not an important synagogue. No one probably had looked at those minutes ever. And he opens the box, and I get an email. It's every historian loves it. It had two words in it: found it. That was the email. And then he very, very kindly, I was in Jerusalem, he was in Cincinnati. They have a very, very good scanner, and he carefully scanned the diary. And we saw a page from it there. Most of the diary is in English. It's not altogether easy to read. I have selections of the diary after the novel. Um, uh, I could make out enough of the handwritten Yiddish. Those who know Yiddish will be able to make out some words. Um, it's also not. It is Yiddish. It's what we call Western Yiddish, not and not East European Yiddish. This is the Yiddish the German Jews spoke, what some call Judeo-German, and she spelt it just the way she heard it. So, for example, the last two words is Umain Sella, but it's not spelled Amen Sella the way anyone would in a prayer book. She knew how it was pronounced, and she spelled it out in Yiddish. The basic idea here, and I got some help with it, um, was that she was writing to the Father of Israel. She was praying to God in the language that she thought God knew, Western Yiddish, to bring her back and save her and really bring her back to the Jewish people. As I mentioned, she, in Venezuela, after her father died, she'd been taken in by a Catholic family. They converted her to Catholicism. She then became totally disaffected with Catholicism, partly because she discovered that the woman who had become her, quote, mother, her Catholic mother, was an adulteress, and she was also very she was very lonely. So she comes back to Judaism, and she prays there to be accepted.
So you've mentioned two things. Well, you've mentioned many things, but two themes here just at the end that I want to pick up on before we move to other people's questions. One is about her transnational experience, and one is about her religious experience. So let's start with the transnational piece. So you said that her father was a crook, and so they traversed the globe in an attempt to escape from the people that he was cheating. So she has this perspective of communities around the world that, American Jews didn't have a glimpse into those communities from a Jewish perspective at that time. So what do we learn about about kind of what the world looked like through the eyes of this Jewish woman in the 19th century from her writing and from her diary?
And it's really fascinating. Uh, so we do have some thick descriptions of a synagogue in Europe, and she clearly knows Central and Western Europe well. Those are her roots. But the most amazing stuff, she goes to India, and she gives us a description of Calcutta, the Jewish community, which is, and I have to admit, I don't know much about that subject. So I consulted with a young a woman historian who's worked on India. And she said, we only have about 2 or 3 descriptions of the Indian Jewish community in the middle of the 19th century. And there is a description of a person with a long beard and so on. She says, "Oh, he must be," and she told me who he was, and indeed read up and saw that. Similarly, she goes to Australia and gives us a description of Australia. We do have a book called Australian Genesis on the early years of the Australian Jewish community. Of course, most of them were convicts who had been shipped off to Australia. And you can really match up what she says with what the historian, who certainly didn't know her work, but what the historian had found, and it matches up nicely. There were early Australian Jewry, for example, had many, many more men than women. And that fits in what she describes. Venezuela, now, alas, the Venezuelan Jewish community has disappeared in our own time, and many of them are in Florida. But she writes about some Jews in Venezuela, and she has uh, close ties also to Curacao. And so there's a lot of very, very interesting material on the Jewish community. And for that reason, I did add notes, not intrusive notes, not footnotes, but I did add notes to the novel because I, I myself was interested in, can I find the background to this? And I thought that some readers would be interested in how it matches up with what we know from other sources. And it does remind us that there were Jews in America in the middle of the 19th century who knew the world. Yeah, transnational. Yeah.
Well, and in part because of this transnational experience, she really, sort of had contact with many different, not only contact, but personal involvement, as you mentioned, with multiple religious traditions, right? She has her spiritualist experience. She has, a conversion to Christianity experience. And certainly that was unusual at the time. I think we can assume. But it's what struck me also is how modern it is, that she has a kind of syncretic, almost a kind of fusion approach where she takes a little bit from different traditions and kind of makes her own experience out of that. So, I as I was reading, I was thinking about how modern that felt. And I was wondering if you can shed light on sort of how she was able to understand the relationship between all of these different traditions, and whether we can learn anything from her approach about, that would apply to 21st century Jewish life.
So it's a really a wonderful question, and it is true. We it's also new. It kind of pushes back this idea of Jews who discovered other religions. There's a new book by Emily Sigalo on Jews and Buddhism and Jew booze. But this, of course, is much earlier, and the in faith, also highly spiritual, was spiritualism. Um, the idea that there were these spirits, and it makes sense that it should spread in the 19th century because once you had the telegraph that suggested to people, wow, there are all sorts of things in the air that we can't see, but are there and have an impact, that had a religious analog. Um, in any case, spiritualism is important because spiritualism didn't view itself as Christian, just as we now have Jews and Buddhism, so we see Jews and spiritualism. And I agree with you, and maybe we'll close with this, that Cora Wilburn is a woman way ahead of her time. She's at home in many different faiths. She's bringing stuff from Judaism to other religions, but she is not wedded to Jewish norms. In the early 20th century, a lot of very liberal people felt that the Jewish form of burial didn't fit their environmental ideas. Of course, we know such today. Um, and here you see the evidence that Cora Wilburn has herself cremated. Uh, According to something I read, she's actually the first Jewish woman to be cremated in Boston. Um, and that too reflects, I think, her effort to be one and the same time, progressive in her values, and thoroughly modern, and yet a proud, by the end of her life, absolutely proud liberal Jew. And her sense was that all that could be synthesized. And, in some ways, it forces us to rethink even where some ideas in Reform Judaism came from, because clearly some of them were influenced by trends in the spiritualist movement.
Right. We have a great question that is near and dear to my heart, which is about, what was her background in education, and did she speak about any of her challenges of navigating the world and writing as a woman? How did she address her experience of gender in all of this?
It's really a wonderful a set of questions, two questions. One is education. Um, she tells us little about her education. It's clear from some materials that her mother played a big role in educating them. They were constantly on the move. So she did that, and I think that played a role. And in some places, they probably hired someone to teach her, or people taught her. She mentions at one point someone who taught her Hebrew letters and so on. She talks a lot, not only here, but in her other writings, about being a woman. She feels that men mistreat women. She feels that um, marriages are, and the spiritualist movement was a woman's movement in many ways. There they could rise up, that and she attacks marriage as an institution, which is not so common in those days. And I think people will see her and say, "Wow, she's a real feminist." And in some of her other writings, she makes clear she's quite feisty, and she's willing, and she fights her father. She is willing to fight others for her place. Probably didn't make her any friends, but um, she's very aware of herself as a woman.
I was struck by how clear her resistance to marriage is. I mean, aside from what we know now about her, that what you've told us, even in her novel, she, sort of ends the last chapter, sort of saying, "You're probably expecting that we should have a marriage here, right?" And she really resists giving that kind of uh, typical expected closure there. Um, what was her relationship like with other Jewish and other women writers at the time? Do we know who she was in conversation with?
Well, so she does correspond with a few rabbis. I found a very long letter to a well-known 19th century rabbi named Bernard Felsenthal. There are some letters of hers that I found in the papers of Sabato Moraeus, who some remember is the founder of the Jewish Theological Seminary. He's the Sephardic Chacham minister in Philadelphia. Um, and then, as I mentioned earlier, um, she does know Mary Anton, who's a very significant East European a writer. And some will know her novel, The Promised Land, that Mary Anton did. Um, and she knew the young Henrietta Zold, although I don't find any other letters between them. Um, she certainly corresponded with non-Jews, and I'm hoping that other letters will surface now that it's here. Fascinatingly, they recently found in one of the small historical societies around Boston a letter that she wrote to a young African American woman, and that makes a lot of sense. She's a liberal, and she's had to fight for her place. African American women were doing the same. Some of the early African American writing appears in the Banner of Light, the same journal. So it's fascinating, really. Um, but even though I suspect there are more letters and sort of hope that a big cache of letters will emerge, I haven't found them.
Well, we have a question here about how many languages she spoke, and I wonder if that will also, how many languages she may have been corresponding in,
Yeah.
even.
So it's clear that she knows German and French, and in the Banner of Light, she translates, and that's a big deal to translate from both. She also knows Spanish, because she lived in Venezuela. Um, she knows a little bit of Hebrew, I think mostly prayer book Hebrew, and clearly spoke Yiddish. My guess is the spoken is better than the written, which is very common among children of immigrants. So those are the languages that I'm clear that she knew, which is a big number, and she admits that she's good at languages, and that's very clear. And perhaps the fact that they were constantly on the move trained her to be good at languages.
Right. Well, we're really, really excited to be able to feature Cora Wilburn at the Jewish Women's Archive in the newly expanded version of the encyclopedia that is launching in June, in which you've very kindly written a new entry for. And maybe the availability of that as well will encourage other scholars to look for her writing around the world. I mean, I wonder if we'll find that there were other correspondences that were going on that we haven't yet uncovered.
It certainly could be. You know, there's a lot of women's material that I think will turn up not only in archives but in people's homes. There are a lot of letters, and I hope now that when it's Cora Wilburn, someone will look online and say, "Oh, Cora Wilburn, I know about her," and that's why I'm so happy that it'll be featured in the encyclopedia, which pops up when somebody puts it online. So we'll see. I see this really as a first word, not by any means as a last word. And I would say that I think literary scholars may read this material differently than a historian does, and that's a good thing. And there's also a lot more to read and study that I hope in time people will indeed pursue.
Well, thank you so much for making it possible for us to engage in her story and to pick up the trail and continue this exploration. It's really wonderful to have this incredible novel to dig into, and I'm also excited to see where it will lead and what is left to uncover. And I'm sure it will also, as you said, it will prompt people to think about all the things that are now available online that we can be searching for in journals and other places that there's still so much of women's history. We've barely scratched the surface. There's so much still that's left to uncover. And there are all kinds of new tools that are made possible now in the digital era for us to do that. So there's a whole new generation of scholarship that awaits us.
Amazing. I just want to thank the both of you so much. Jonathan Sarna, it's such an honor to have you here with us in Seattle virtually. And Judith, thank you so much for your incredible questions. And I am definitely thrown back to an era where I worked for the Jewish Women's Archive and spent a lot of time here in Seattle at the Special Archives collection, looking at all of the research on Jewish women. There's much there, and I just recommend everyone, if you can and when you can, go to the archive. And there actually is a Jewish Archives project here in Seattle. Some of it has made its way into the JWA site as well. And you can learn about the women in our own community. And then this becomes part of the canon of the Promised Land and others. So thank you so much for a wonderful book. Thank you all for joining us, and be safe, be well, and we'll see you hopefully again soon when we can be virtually together again. Bye-bye.